What a surreal, sweet moment for me. I was 19 and a student at UCLA. And somehow I got an invitation to a house party in West Hollywood where there was a rabbi teaching. And me and a couple of friends from Hillel went, and the first thing we saw, we opened the door, was a real-life Emmy. I think it was the Nevin's house. I said, this is pretty cool. And it got better from there. And we sat down, and Rabbi Brous, you taught, and my friends and I left and said, we've never heard anything like that before. And we started coming to Ikar, which had just been born. I think it was just at the end of the first year. And the place was electric, unbelievable. It was packed with all of these young people, every single one of them cooler than me. And I just sort of hung on the back, including, and I didn't know at that time, my wife, who came to the very second service that Ikar ever put on. So she was in the room, so for sure everybody was cooler than me. And you talked about a Judaism that was supposed to set us on fire, that was supposed to ignite a passion in us for justice and a love in us for each other, that if we walked out the door the same as we walked in, that we had wasted our time. And my head had already started to go in the direction of going to rabbinical school, but Ikar and your Torah reached my heart. And it gave me the chutzpah to actually do the application and to write in my essay all of the things I was hearing at Ikar. And now you're here on my first senior rabbi bima. And that's the case because of you. And so I am just beyond, I'm really beside myself. You know, and our story continued. I worked for you right after rabbinical school. You gave me my first job in the rabbinate. You stood under the chuppah with Ann and I. You have been an ongoing, constant source of wisdom and guidance and care in my life and in the life of my family. And now to get to be in this conversation together with all of these other people who I love, it's just so very, very sweet. And so thank you for being here. You have been traveling the whole country and talking with so many people, and the fact that we get to have you is extraordinary. And it's extraordinary we get to talk about this incredible book that you have put out so that the numbers of people who can be touched and lit on fire by your Torah can just expand and expand and expand. Last night, Ann and I were talking, and she had just finished the audiobook. I opened the door, and she was a little weepy at the end of the audiobook. She said, it's just so good. She said, it's a love letter to Ikar. It's a love letter to this community. So before we talk about the content of the book and the meaning of showing up, can you just talk to us a little bit about what makes Ikar Ikar?
Okay, first of all, hi. Is it working? Okay, hi everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here and really honored. And it's true, I've been traveling a lot, but this was one of the first talks that we locked in on the calendar months and months and months ago, and I'm so grateful to all of you for welcoming me into your home. Do you know how incredibly blessed you are, right? Yes. Okay. I mean, there are amazing rabbis in Orange County, and many of you are here, and I'm grateful for all of you. And just a word about Rabbi Adam Greenwald and Ann Ramatka, who, I remember him when he was just Adam, when he came in when he was 19 years old into Ikar. And I really think that in this community, you have truly one of the great teachers of Torah alive in the world today. An exceptional soul and a deeply compassionate human being, and someone whose Torah, every single time I hear you give a Devar Torah, a sermon or teach a class, I think, my God, how did he see that? Where did that come from? And it's just your gift to our Jewish community, and I feel so blessed to be your friend and your colleague. And Ann Ramatka, who's also here in this room somewhere, where are you? Hi. And who also is just an extraordinary educator and artist, and who, for many, many years, just took our community to the next level. Some of the ideas, some of the exercises that I talk about in the book are things that Anne actually turned into art. And so we'll talk. I hope we'll get to talk about some of that over the course of today. But please know how deeply moved I am by you and your rabbinic presence and voice. And I don't even remember the question you asked me. So I was just. It is a love letter. It is a love letter to Ikar. The book, I feel that way. And in fact, I told my community, this is a love letter that after 20 years of building and pastoring to this community, I felt the community deserved to have some of these stories and some of the Torah that's at the driving heart of what we've built to be written down so that it can hopefully outlive all of us. The community, we started in the spring of 2004, and really at that time I was motivated by the fact that in the public space, religion was increasingly defined by religious voices that were extreme, fundamentalist, regressive, and often violent. And it felt like it felt that at that moment when we needed more than anything a really powerful counter testimony to those voices, that I struggled to find places where Judaism just felt joyous and loving and justice driven and alive. And it seemed to me that if we could reclaim some of that kind of fierce beauty of our tradition, that we could also address what was in many ways the defining crisis of the Jewish community 20, 25 years ago, which was this incredible disconnect that so many young people had from institutional religion, and this sense that, people who were hungry for spirituality, for connection, for ritual, for community, for God, were not looking in the synagogues for it. And I thought maybe if we did this reclamation work, this sacred work of reclaiming the heart of our tradition, maybe some of those folks, not only young, but of all ages, who'd been so uninterested in what was happening in the institutional spaces, would find their way back in. And so this was a holy journey, not because those spaces were devoid of meaning and connection and community, but because young people perceived them to be. And so I felt like we had to create a bridge, some kind of translation mechanism, so that folks would know that that our hearts and our spirits could actually be filled with our own Jewish tradition. I mean, I talked to so many people who, one woman I remember told me that she used to drive from West LA to Burbank for yoga because that was just where the best yoga teacher was, who inspired her and moved her. And I thought, my God, and yet people won't drive 10 minutes to shul because it's out of their way. And so what would it mean to create, to change our perception of what this sacred tradition has to offer us, and help us figure out that really that we could engage deeply with our Jewish tradition as a way of living lives of meaning and purpose, and that our Jewish tradition demanded something of us in a time of moral crisis, in a time of poverty and war and racism and so much human cruelty, that we actually have a guidebook to help us understand how to live through these most difficult and confusing moments. And so really at the intersection of those two questions, the community was born. And then, and we were kind of fresh out of the gate. You were there just shortly after we began. And the community was growing and growing, and we were moving so fast. And I realized about 10 years into building Ikar, which was around 10, 11 years ago, that I spoke so much about what it meant to reanimate our Jewish tradition, to give people access to their own sacred inheritance, to learn Talmud and Mishnah and Torah as their own, to engage the liturgy as our own. I spoke a lot about justice and what it means to live in a cruel world, and to dream of a world of love and justice, and then to try to work together to implement it. What I had not done was I had never given a single sermon in the first 10 years of Ikar talking about how we who dream of building the beloved community out there in the world, Dr. King's vision of a world redeemed, needed to start by engaging in true acts of love and justice toward one another. That you can't build a dream out there if you cannot manifest that dream in here. And that sermon was called the Amen Effect. I think that Ben and Mindy were in the room for it. I think you and Anne were in the room for it, and probably others who were here, maybe your folks too. And something changed in the community when I spoke this way. Something shifted. The community, I think that it was something that we all sensed before, but I had never spoken of it as a religious obligation. I had never centered that as really the call of the community. And all of a sudden, people started showing up for each other in different ways than they had before, in really powerful ways. Showing up at Shiva, showing up at funerals, showing up at the bedside, dancing with strangers on Shabbat. You know, like somebody, I don't know this kid who's become bat mitzvah, but it's a simcha. It's a joyous moment. I'm getting up there and I'm going to dance. And it just sort of shifted the dynamic of the community, and it did not detract from our justice work. In fact, it made us, it was kind of the fuel for the work that we were doing in the world. And for us, it was kind of a transformative moment. So I think I answered your first question and maybe your second that you haven't asked yet all at once. So
It's so interesting to hear that thought process from you, and for you to have watched the trajectory of the community, because we who participated in the community could feel it. But you're laying out sort of what was happening behind the scenes as you were trying to guide us into taking our values that we were living out there and living with each other. And yet, people have been asking you to write a book for 20 years. And you needed to find what was the idea that you wanted to put between covers. And this was the thing that got you to actually write the book and put it out there. What is it about this idea? What is it about the Amen Effect, about showing up for each other, that feels like it's the Ikar, it's the essence of the Torah that you want to give to all of us?
Oh, thank you for that question. So, well, I'll tell you, I didn't set out to write this book. First of all, the only reason I wrote a book is because my husband is relentless. And literally every single day we would go out on our morning run and he would say, when are you going to write your book? When are you going to write your book? When are you going to write your book? And I'm like, I have to just write it just so that we have something else to talk about. So you can thank David Light for that and most good things in my life. And also, David Light is the brother of Rabbi Stuart Light and Vipka Light, who are here, beloved educators in our community also, and my dear beloved brother and sister-in-law. And so I'll just, this is kind of a little bit of a detour, but rabbis do this. Some literary agent from New York cold called me essentially like 10 or 11 years ago and said, someone from your community just sent me a sermon that you wrote, and I think this should be a book. If you're ever ready to write, let me know. And I was like, delete. And then he wrote back 6 months later and said, this sermon could also be a book. And I'm like, delete. And essentially this guy, I don't know how this blessing came into my life, but this agent, who turns out to be legit and not just a creep with my email address, he ended up tracking me essentially every 6 months for the last 10 years. And finally, I was on a college tour with my kid a couple years ago, and it was right, we were just coming out of COVID, and I thought I really need a sabbatical. I haven't taken a day off in like 18 years, and if I don't take a break now, so maybe I'll just call that agent and see, if there's anything here. And I called him back and I said, you've been bothering me for many, many years. So what are the next steps? And he said, well, I'm sure you have an idea that you've been running through your head. Just write down one paragraph for each chapter and send it to me. So I sent him 10 paragraphs of, I had this crazy idea. So he called me immediately and he said, this book would be fine, but what the book you should write is chapter 8. What you have here, the 8th chapter. And before I even looked back to see what I had written, I thought, oh my God, it's the Amen Effect. I know it is, because that's the sermon that basically changed our community. And that's the sermon that, as I've done scholar in residence over the last 10 years since I gave it at Ikar, that's the one where the people cry and stay afterwards to talk, and we build relationship, and it touches us in a different way. And I thought I was going to write some kind of manifesto or something. And he's like, no, you go right to the heart. And so this wonderful agent, actually, he kind of pulled this book out of me, and I wasn't prepared to write it, but as soon as he said it, I knew he was right. And I sat down and I'm like, my sabbatical is going to start in a month. I got to write a book proposal and a plan and just get ready to go. And then, we sold the book like literally the first week of my sabbatical. So so I'm so glad that he was he sort of pushed me on this path. Okay, so but I think that your question was you were asking why this book? Why is this the message that I decided to share?
What is it about this idea that we are here to see each other in a different way? That's the message that we need to hear. Why is this our Torah for our times?
Okay, so essentially the premise of the book, or the story behind the story, is that we're living through a time of many compounding crises. Chief among them, perhaps, is the crisis of loneliness, social alienation, and isolation, which we now know is not only hurting our spirits, but it's actually hurting our bodies. And the Surgeon General has been really heroic in lifting this conversation up over the last couple of years. I became interested in the science of loneliness about 10 or 11 years ago when I first gave this sermon. What we were starting to learn at that time from the research of someone named Dr. John Cacioppo was that loneliness doesn't just hurt our hearts. It doesn't just make us feel bad. It actually hurts our hearts, meaning it has the health impact of smoking 15 cigarettes a day on our hearts and on our lungs. It causes early onset Alzheimer's and dementia, other health problems. And so we have to take loneliness seriously, both from medical reasons and for spiritual reasons. And as I write about toward the end of the book, Hannah Arendt, the great 20th century philosopher, writes that loneliness and social alienation and isolation are actually preconditions of totalitarianism. That you cannot have a tyrannical regime take over a society if the people in that society are connected to each other, if they know each other and trust each other and care about each other. And this means that crisis is not just a crisis of spirit and a crisis of body, but it's actually a crisis of our democracy. Because if you think about it, conspiracy theories cannot take hold in a society in which we know each other. Because you hear some crazy, loony theory about Jews controlling the weather, and if you don't know any Jews, but you know it's raining on your wedding day, it makes sense to blame the Jews, right? But if you happen to have a Jewish neighbor and you're like, wait a second, it rained on her wedding day too, that doesn't check out. So we need to know each other. And actually in studies that came out before COVID, which exacerbated every bad trend in our lives, before COVID, we discovered as a society that 30% of Americans do not know the names of their next door neighbors. Does everyone in this room know the names of your next door neighbors? Okay, because you're the good people. These are the good people. The Orange County people are the good people. So 30% of Americans actually don't, and 20% of Americans pre-COVID said they did not have one single person in their lives who they would call a confidant. Not one person to share their fear, their love, their anxiety, their concerns about the world. We are in a crisis. And so the reason I wrote the book is because the fierce urgency of now leads me to believe that we are in a moment in which we are retreating from each other. And it's breaking our hearts, it's breaking our bodies, it threatens to break our society, and precisely at a time where we feel totally powerless against the powers that be in the world, right? Because there are so many compounding crises, we are not powerless in the face of this crisis, because there actually is a lot that we can do to respond to the crisis of retreat, and it starts with showing up. It starts with actually leaning into relationship with one another in the most basic and simple ways that we know can actually have a transformative impact on our spirits, on our bodies, on our communities, and hopefully on our democracy. And so the idea of the book is essentially like, take agency. Take agency now, because we can. And I would say that the effect of the last 4.5 months on our spirits and communities and bodies, et cetera, has only reinforced my sense of how fiercely urgent this message is, because we feel even more powerless than we did before. We feel even more disconnected and isolated, and this kind of existential loneliness that many of us experienced individually before, we now feel as a Jewish community. So what can we do about it? Well, we don't throw our hands up in the air and give up. We don't further push ourselves into the kind of inertia, the pull that pulls us into further retreat. We actually step toward one another at precisely the moment that our inclination is to pull away.
That's really hard. Right? It's really, really hard. It's hard because there are social forces holding us back. It's hard because there's internal voices of doubt that make us question whether our neighbors want us to knock on their door, or what it is to walk into the home of somebody who is in a moment of crisis, what it is to show up to the shiva or to show up to the funeral. You taught me, and this is one of the things I quote in your name all the time, to err on the side of presence, to, if we're going to make the mistake of showing up too much, not too little. But it's a really hard thing to do. So what guidance does our tradition offer? What guidance do you offer from 20 years of leading community in this that can empower us, that can make us a little bit more brave?
Okay, so I'm going to take a step back for a moment and just lay out, for folks who haven't read the book yet, the central paradigm of the book, because I think it will help us answer this question. So the book is a love letter to Ikar, my community, but it's also kind of a love story between a girl and a Mishnah. So I know that's like the nerdiest thing I've ever said, but I'm going to explain why. So the Mishnah, this ancient Jewish compendium of law, codified around the year 220 CE. The Mishnah contains in it this ritual that could easily be overlooked, honestly. It is a bit of an obscure ritual, but it's a pilgrimage ritual. I first encountered it when I was in seminary. I didn't understand it. I think I hadn't experienced enough of life yet to understand it. I photocopied it. I folded it up, and I put it back inside my book and back on the shelf. Then we moved to LA. We built Ikar. Honestly, I officiated a lot of weddings, and I officiated a lot of divorces. I named babies, and I stood at the graveside with people. And then one day I pulled the book off my shelf, and the piece of paper came fluttering out, and I saw it again. And so this is what the Mishnah says. It says that in ancient days, the Jews used to come up on pilgrimage to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They would come from all across the land. They would ascend to Jerusalem, which of course is a city on a hill. They would then climb the steps of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and they would enter through this beautiful arched entryway. And some of you have entered through some of those arched entryways in the old city of Jerusalem, so you can kind of get the sense of what that must have felt like. And then en masse, hundreds of thousands of people at once used to come in, and they would just simply turn to the right, and they would circle all the way around the perimeter of the courtyard. And imagine the Hajj. Have you seen videos of the Hajj in Mecca? What the pilgrimage looks like? It's just masses of people walking around, and then they would make it all the way around the courtyard of the Temple Mount, and they would exit essentially right at the same place where they had entered. Except the text says, for someone with a broken heart. And that person would go up to Jerusalem, go up the steps of the Temple Mount, enter through the same entryway, but turn to the left, where everyone else turned to the right. And they would walk against the current of hundreds of thousands of people going this way, and me and my broken heart going this way. And when a person coming this way would pass this person, they would have to look them in the eye and say to them one simple phrase: Malach, what happened to you? What's your story? What happened to your heart? Why does your heart ache? And the person who's going this way would answer saying, Ani Avel, I'm a mourner. My loved one died just last month. I can't even tell which way is up. I'm completely turned around. Or they would say, my partner just left, and I feel totally blindsided by it. I did not see this coming. Or I'm just so worried about my kid, and I just wish someone could tell me that she's going to be okay. And then the person who's going this way would offer them a blessing. They would say, may the one who dwells in this place bring you comfort as you navigate this difficult chapter. Or may you be held by love, even as you walk through this time of illness. Or may you always know that you are connected to something greater than yourself, even when you feel most alone. And that was it. That was the end of the ritual. And then they would go out and finish their circle and leave. And what I realized that was so transformative for me about this ritual is that none of the parties who are participating in this ancient ritual want to be doing what they're doing. Because the person who's brokenhearted doesn't even want to get out of bed, let alone get dressed and show up in a place where there are hundreds of thousands of people. And yet they do. They're not exempt from going on this ritual, from going to the pilgrimage. And they go up there, and yet they're not allowed to turn to the right like everybody else and pretend that they're okay, because they're not okay, because their hearts are broken. And so instead, they walk literally in the other direction. And I wonder how many of you here have ever been brokenhearted and even heard yourself saying these words. It feels like the whole world's walking in one direction and I'm going in the other, right? So that's what the rabbis were actually intuiting when they wrote about this ritual. And the people who are going this way are literally having the time of their lives. I read, when I was researching the book, I started reading firsthand accounts of people who went on the Hajj, because it's really our best contemporary analog. And it is incredible. It's incredible to be part of this mass of humanity who are just singing together and moving together in this kind of dramatic spiritual work that you do when you're on pilgrimage. And yet you see some stranger with puffy eyes, some like miskane who's coming toward you, and you have to pull out of the crowd and be like, hold on a minute, let me go check on this stranger who looks weird and is walking in the wrong direction. You don't want to do that. And yet you have to. And if you take a step back and look at the ritual, that is actually why you're there. You're there in order to see the brokenhearted person. That is the sacred work of pilgrimage. And what do we do when we see them? We ask a question. We just hold curiosity and compassion and say, tell me what happened to you? What does it look like from your perspective? And we pay attention to them as they answer. And then we bless them. And this is just astonishing. The brokenhearted people who don't even want to get out of bed, they don't go to the Temple Mount to get blessed by the high priest, or even by the regular priest, or even by the rabbis. They go there to get blessed by each other, by the other people, the regular people, because we all have the capacity to give blessings to each other. We just don't realize it. And so it's a kind of radical democratization of sacred care, of sacred accompaniment. So now, to answer your question, like, there are so many good reasons why we don't show up, why we avoid the gaze of the person who's coming toward us when we're okay. We are scared of their pain, right? We think that we will say the wrong words and hurt them even more than they're already hurt, which is possible, right? You can say very hurtful things to people who are already in pain. I wish I could say, you'll never hurt someone in pain, but you can absolutely hurt someone, and there are things not to say, like things like, you'll have another child, right? Things like, God only gives what we can receive. There are things we can say that would be hurtful, but retreating from each other is even more hurtful. There are other reasons why we don't show up. We're afraid that the pain is contagious. We're afraid that divorce is contagious. If I get too close to you and your pain, I might have to start to think about my own relationship and where the cracks might be in those walls. If I get too close to you after your traumatic loss, I might have to realize that I'm also vulnerable to that kind of tragedy striking my family. So there are lots of reasons why we stay away. And what the tradition is saying is, don't avoid each other in these moments. It is absolutely essential that even when every instinct in our body is pulling us away, that instead we step toward. And the way that we do it is we step toward each other with compassion and with curiosity. We see each other in our humanity and we ask, tell me what you see from your perspective. Like, how are you holding your grief? How are you thinking about your loved one today? Right? These are questions that come from a place of curiosity that invite us into relationship and into conversation, and then offer blessings because we can. So that's the dynamic that I think is at the heart of, when we're sitting at home going, well, I don't even know him that well, and there'll be tons of people at that funeral. Do I really need to go? Or I'm going into that shiva and I'm terrified because their loss shakes me to the core. What should I say? Start with wonder. Start with curiosity, start with compassion, start with seeing the humanity in the other, and then let the conversation take its course.
And even, our tradition offers us the possibility of starting with silence, of just silent presence and allowing the other person to take the lead. And I remember Anne and I were actually on our honeymoon when one of my best friends' father died. We were on the East Coast and he was in San Francisco, and Anne very graciously let me fly home for 24 hours to go to the funeral, and flew through the night and got there. And I saw my friend Joel on the steps of the chapel, and I walked over to him to immediately start to say, "I'm so terribly sorry about your father." And before words came out of my mouth, he said, "I need you to walk me away from everyone, and I need you to talk to me about your honeymoon." He said, "I cannot talk about my dad anymore for 5 more minutes." And so we walked, and we took a walk through the cemetery, and I told him about, we were on the East Coast and it was fall and the leaves were beautiful and we were driving around and experiencing these little towns. And we talked for 10 minutes and he said, "Okay, I can go back and bury my dad now." And it was just this reinforcing of this wisdom of needed to show up, but I didn't know what he needed. And I was so grateful that he told me what he needed, and so often people don't, right? But in that moment, he was able to find the words and tell me what he needed. And that was a gift that I could offer, but it was really a gift he gave back. Are there other things that you see, that you have seen, and you tell these amazing stories in the book of the way people have shown up in just the very, very worst of times, of things that people have offered one another that we can tuck away for when, God forbid, we need to draw from that toolkit?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And Anne, thanks for letting Adam leave your honeymoon and go to his friend's father's funeral. I actually think that there are some moments that become the defining moments of our lives, and very often they have to do with showing up for people in times like this. And I share in the book this kind of painful story in chapter 1 about my Rabbi Marcelo, and he was in New York, and I had already moved to LA, and his mother died, and I literally, he's a beloved rabbi of a big community in New York. And I thought, oh my God, this poor guy is going to be just like totally surrounded by love to the point of the extreme. There's no way I'm flying in. And I didn't even call him because I thought I was doing him a favor. So I wrote him a letter and I mailed it, which I think is still a very nice thing to do, by the way. But he was really hurt. And he said to me the next time I saw him, he said, "I really needed you and you weren't there." He said, "Next time, just show up." And that's when I came up with the, err on the side of presence. And so, by the way, when he said that at first, I was so defensive and so hurt. Like, I have 2 little babies at home, and and I have a community, and and then I thought, oh, he's right. He's right, actually. I should have shown up for him. And I will say that, my father died just before Rosh Hashanah this year. And our dearest, one of our oldest, dearest friends, Greg from New York, he literally flew in like you did, not from his honeymoon, but he flew in for 6 hours to just be at Shiva. And I think I'll remember it for the rest of my life. And Stu and V, I remember, came up to walk with us around the block as our Shiva ended, and then just sat on the grass for a couple hours afterwards to decompress after the Shiva. These showing up in these moments, they get embedded in your heart. And I'm sure it was terribly hard to make the decision, even to ask for it and to grant this. No, it was easy and obvious. But for the rest of us, I don't know. But it does matter, and it becomes a defining part of your story. So you mentioned to find the words. So I want to just give a recommendation, which is this book called Finding the Words, which was written by a beautiful man in our community, Colin Campbell. And he wrote it. I speak a lot about Gail and Colin in the book. They're beloved community members who their family suffered a horrific tragedy when they were driving to Joshua Tree for a little getaway with their kids in the car, and they were struck by a drunk driver who was driving over 90 miles an hour, drunk and high, and no headlights on at 10 o'clock at night. And both their kids were killed. And it was a horrible, upending tragedy. And it's exactly the kind of tragedy where people retreat. because nobody wants to confront that. Nobody wants to think, oh my God, like they did everything right. Everyone was in seatbelts. They were driving under the speed limit, like everything right. And sometimes the world is just terrible and unfair. And so one of the things, there are a couple of stories that I share in there that of what I learned from them. One of them is from the doctor who actually called that night, who made the call that the kids hadn't survived. And immediately after the kind of death announcement came this beautiful doctor in the middle of the desert, in the middle of this, in this tiny hospital, in the middle of the worst night of their lives, immediately took them both by the hand and brought them into a quiet room and said, tell me about Ruby and tell me about Hart. And Colin said, and writes in his book about this moment, and said it was like the most incredible gift that she gave us, because she saw our kids not just as a tragedy, but as human beings who lived in this world, and she helped us shape how we would remember them and how we would try to give other people the opportunity to remember them too. And so that was an incredible Torah for me, that this doctor kind of instinctively did not pull away. And I'm sure everything in her body also wanted her to retreat from them, but she didn't. But what we did, because we knew how hard how hard it would be for the community that wanted to do the right thing but didn't know how to do the right thing, we actually we like created this set of rules, and we printed them out and put them on cards that were at the entrance to the shiva. And those rules were then subsequently honed over time by both Colin and his wife Gail, who are brilliant and like incredible humans, obviously. But they wrote things like, we do want to talk about our kids. Please don't avoid saying their names. We want you to ask us about Ruby and Hart. We also want to hear about your kids. We are glad that they're alive. And so don't resist telling us about your own children. And, I started having breakfasts with them, after the tragedy happened. We had these kind of regular check-ins, and we were doing them every week. And then one of the days that I was supposed to meet them for breakfast was the first day of school a few months later. And I got stuck dropping one of my kids off at school, and I was late to the breakfast, and I walked in and I felt so guilty, and I'm like, I'm so sorry, there was traffic, there was blah, blah. And they're like, Sharon, we know that it was the first day of school. We're glad your kids are alive. It's okay for you to say I was dropping my kids off at school. So they said things like, it's okay to tell us about your kids. We want to hear stories about your kids. We just don't want you to hear too many stories about your kids, right? Like, don't go into like a 2-hour drama about how your kid lost their cell phone. We don't care about that. But we do want to know that your kids are alive and well, because we love you and we love your children. So they basically made these rules, and it was really helpful for the for the people who came to support them. And for Gail, when she went back to work, she printed out this list. She sent the list of rules to everybody at work. So I think that there's a lot of important lesson there. Like, sometimes we know what we need, and we're hurt and upset that the people around us don't intuit what we need, but your friend understood that he needed to tell you, like, right now I need to hear about you and Anne and the leaves on the East Coast. That's what I need right now. So it's also for the mourners to essentially, instead of saying, there was a death by suicide, a young person connected to our community, and a lot of this kid's best friends were all ICAR members, and they were really broken up, like really devastated, dealing with death for the first time and the death of a young person. And so I talked to each of them individually, and they're like, my friends, they were, I think, first years or sophomores in college. They're like, my friends have no idea. They're like, come on, we're going to go drinking. We're going to distract you. We're going to take your mind off it. I'm like, try not to be angry with them for not knowing. Nobody knows how to deal with this kind of loss. Instead, let's talk about how you can tell them what you do need. And so we took a page out of this book of like, I don't want to get drunk and forget about my friend. I want to talk about my friend. I want to talk about how scary it is to think that a 19-year-old could end his life. And so can we invite others to be the kind of support system that we actually need?
The book, by the way, Finding the Words, is back in the spiritual charging station that we have set up over there. Really do encourage you to find Colin's incredible, incredible book. It's a difficult read, but so powerful. In a moment, we're going to open it up for just a few people to ask some questions. So if you do have a question, we won't be able to get to more than a handful, but want to give the opportunity for that. But before that, I did want to ask about your dad. I was a big fan of Rick. I think we had some kindred spirit. We were both kind of grumpy old Jewish man on the inside. He was on the outside, and I'm a grumpy old Jewish man on the inside. And we share a deep love of ice cream and of your Torah. And those were powerful bonds, and I really cared very, very much for him. And you lost your dad right before Rosh Hashanah, and then you needed to stand up and be in front of a community of people and go on this tour and talk about what it is to stand with people and to see people and to show up for people. All the while, you are still in Avel. You are still saying Kaddish, and at the close of tonight, we're going to give opportunity for us to be your minion to say Kaddish for you. What do you know now being on the other side?
First of all, every time you would get up to speak, my dad was like, I know it's going to be a good one. So he really did love you and your parents, and so thank you for bringing him here in spirit. I'll tell you, I really wrote the book from the vantage point of someone who has been fairly blessed to walk through my years so far and turn to the right most days. And I've had loss. I've had people I love who have died, but I wasn't in Avela yet. I hadn't yet lost an immediate family member. I've certainly had struggles and challenges, but most of the time I was, both by nature and by profession, a person who would enter the holy space, turn and keep my eyes up and see like who here needs to be held. I was talking to Nancy about this earlier, and what it means for those of us who are, who are oriented that way, to be kind of caregivers. And so then my father died, and as Rabbi Greenwald said, I went right into the High Holy Days. I talked about it on Rosh Hashanah day 1, because Shloshim was, my initial period of grieving was cut short by the holidays, but that also meant that I had this opportunity to talk about him in public, and I did talk about death denial in our culture and what it meant for me to kind of resist the urge to deny that he was dying and instead really speak honestly with him about what we all knew was happening. There's a piece of the book where I talk about my failure to talk about death with my grandma who was dying. And I knew that the right thing was for me to say to her, Grandma, you're dying. How do you want to spend your last days? But I couldn't do it. I couldn't break her heart. And I really regretted it, and I wrote about it in the book. And so when it came time for my father, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and I basically sat him down and said, Dad, I hope you have, a long, many, many years, but I need to talk to you now while you still have all of your bearings about what matters most to you in this world. And then we will do everything we can to honor that for as long as you have. And so we had the hard conversation right up front, and then we had it again and again and again. I would basically check back every few months, like my agent, this relentless agent. I'm like, okay, I'm just checking back. You told me, that the two most important things for you were to be home, if at all possible, and to be with my mother, if at all possible. And so I just want to check back. Are those still the two most important things? And he would say, yes, they are. Yes, they are. Until literally the week that we put him on hospice, right before he died. And so anyway, I essentially, this happened after I had closed the manuscript and before the book launched. And then I went into the High Holy Days, and I kept saying to myself, I can't really grieve right now. I can't really grieve. I'm going to grieve acharei chagim, like after the holidays. That's what we say when everyone's like, oh, Rabbi, can I just pick your brain for a few minutes? You're like, acharei chagim. Like, we'll do this after the holidays. The holidays, of course, culminating in Simchat Torah. And so then I was grieving not only individually, but also like part of this collective grief that we were having. So I went into the booth in November to record my audiobook, and I was terrified because I had not encountered my manuscript for almost a year, and the whole world was different. And I wrote the book as someone who entered and turned to the right, and I was now reading the book and bringing the book into the world as someone who in really many ways was turning to the left. and kind of relying on community to hold me. Can I get a minion that can say amen to my Kaddish? We are all brokenhearted. Who's here to hold our broken hearts? And I read it very trepidatiously. I mean, I literally was terrified that the book would be from a world gone by and wouldn't apply anymore. And I was so relieved as I was reading it that it's still, the wisdom held. And the reason why is because it's ancient wisdom, because the rabbis understood. They wrote from both vantage points. I did not. I wrote from this vantage point, but they understood the world from both the position of the people who are okay and the people who are not at all okay. And I had, I had taken in their wisdom enough that I could write the book that would speak to both moments. So it's been really painful and really wonderful at the same time to be able to speak about this in this moment, not just as an Avela, but also as just a Jew in the world. As soon as October 7th happened, I recognized that the feeling that I was having, which was the feeling that so many other Jews were expressing, I recognized it immediately as loneliness, right? That this kind of sense of abandonment, this sense that nobody, who's here to receive me as I turn to the left, and the people who I've invested in and seen as I've walked to the right, what if they're not here for me now? And so I immediately was able to process those layers of grief through the lens of the tradition, through the lens of the wisdom of this ancient circling ritual. And that's been a great source of strength, even as it's also been challenging and painful to navigate this time.
Invite, if a few people want to come up to the microphone, we have time for 2 or 3 questions. Want to invite anybody who'd like to do that to come on up. Make your way. Why don't we, for the sake of our live stream, why don't you come on up? And Elizabeth, you can also.
Okay, so my question is, Judaism gives us really prescribed, very specific ritual around grieving and death. And that can feel really, really safe and secure because you know what you're supposed to do. But what of those rituals in our modern world do you feel now constricting or hampering? And how do you deal with that push and pull to try and honor the ancient wisdom of what they knew and also live your life and acknowledge that we're not where they were?
That's such a beautiful question. Thank you for that. I had actually, I'll just share personally that I bought a year ago tickets to Coldplay concert at the Snapdragon Theater, and that was supposed to be right after Yom Kippur, between Yom Kippur and Sukkot. And it was going to be this great big thing. My daughter is a senior in high school, and so we bought it with friends whose kids are also seniors, and it was going to be this big shared moment of we're doing something crazy right out, in between the holidays. And of course, I was in Avela, and one of the traditions for mourners is that we don't hear live music during the year of mourning. And I didn't know what to do because I thought this was less about the music and more about the family adventure and the time together. And because the holidays pull me away from the family, this would put me in the family. I was really struggling with exactly the question you're asking. And I actually talked to one of my dear friends who's a posek, who's a halachic decisor, who is, let me try to say that in words that aren't, who is a Jewish legal, ruler, right? Decisor, okay. It's like when you translate a Jewish concept in terms of other Jewish, okay. A rabbi, yeah. And he said that during his year of mourning for his own father, that the only time he felt he could grieve was when he heard live music, because the music triggered in him his tears. And he felt so, but he didn't want to do it anywhere near his community, so he would literally go to the next town over and listen to live music so that he could grieve. He had to find a way to make it work. Now, I ultimately decided not to go to the Coldplay concert because I thought it would just be too awesome and too soon after my father's death. But I really resonated to what he was saying. And I will say, I really think that the Jewish mourning rituals are one of the things that Jews do best in the world. And there's so much wisdom to the prescriptions of our tradition that, the idea of burying as quickly as possible. from dust to dust, the idea of the most simple coffin, the idea that, the way that we walk, that we bury with our own hands, that everybody participates in the burial, that we walk away from the graveside by forming two lines and the mourners walk through them. And we essentially say, like, you might feel like you're falling off the edge of the earth right now, but there's love to the right of you and love to the left. The idea of Shiva and then Shloshim and then Yahrzeit. And yes, like all these things are so brilliant, and they might not be exactly right for you, just as they weren't for my rabbi friend. And sometimes I've struggled with if they're so right for me. And so I think we have to understand that these are rules that were written by human beings in order to help human beings grieve. And they're great guidelines. And if you need to grieve through hearing live music, go to the next town over and hear your live music and cry, because your loved one deserves, and you deserve to cry.
Rabbi Brous, I taught yesterday the Mea Shiloach on the line from the Parsha, don't make a Elohim Masecha, a molten God. And the Mea Shiloach, the Ishbitzer Rabbi, says what that's forbidding is making a God who is hardened into iron. Don't make a principle which is hardened into iron, because sometimes your heart knows better than your head. And you can make an idol, he says, even of these principles that we're supposed to hold, and your heart knows when you're doing it. Thank you for that empowering wisdom. Sometimes go to the next town over and listen to the business that makes you cry. Thank you for that. Please.
First, I just want to say thank you. My mother and I don't want to cry, geez. Started attending ECAR virtually 3 years ago. Our father passed away. You were his first Yizkor service, and so thank you. But that's not my question. My question is, if you could speak to our kids that are in college right now. I have a senior in college. It's really hard to be Jewish right now at college. And if you just had a few words for them, how they can still have, I saw your sermon the other day, empathy for everything that's going on in Gaza, but still stand in your Jewishness and not be afraid, because it's really frightening. It's really scary. Campuses all over. We all know that.
Yeah. First of all, I'm so sorry for the death of your father, and I hope his memory is always a blessing for you. My daughter's a sophomore in college. She's in one of the schools that's kind of the epicenter of a lot of the terrible stuff that's going on. It's really hard. It's really hard. And I feel in some ways like the grown-ups have failed our kids. They failed immediately after October 7th to create safe environments and to set clear lines about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. What's the difference between, free speech and hate speech. And so I think that's been really painful to see. And I'm very worried. I mean, in my daughter's school, like Jewish kids are leaving, which is just, you see Jews being removed or removing themselves from public spaces. There's talk about building, the Jewish IVs now and building schools that are safe for Jews. And I think this is not the way forward for us. And I can see why and how it's so hard. So the first, I was in a conversation with somebody, a public conversation recently, somebody who said, the only answer to this moment is Jewish pride, Jewish pride, Jewish pride, and everybody applauded, standing ovation. And, and I said, I really agree, and I literally got him again, David, because I didn't want to be, look, in my line of work, everybody knows I'm a Jew, but when I'm on the airplane in between my, my work thing, not everyone knows I'm a Jew, and I felt like, no, I want you to know who you're sitting next to. And so I feel like I felt that personally. And yes, Jewish pride. And part of what I feel so proud of from our Jewish tradition is our moral core, is our ability to empathize and to feel anguish and to see the humanity, even in people who are walking in this direction when we're going in this direction. And as I talk about in chapter 8 of my book, not only for people who see the world the same way that we do, but actually to see people who whose perspective on the world might be very painful for us, and still maybe not even coming toward us, but coming at us. You know what I'm saying? And still to be able to look to those people with curiosity and with wonder and with care and say, I can see that you're brokenhearted right now, and so am I. what do you see from your vantage point? And that's very hard when someone's screaming at you at the gates of your university and telling you that you're a terrorist and that you're a genocider and all the things. I'm not suggesting like we do, walk up to a protester and say like, I'm curious, tell me what you see. But I think part of being a Jew and part of being proud of our Jewish heritage is knowing that there's so much brokenheartedness around us, and trying to actually find the quieter, more intimate spaces where we can say to somebody who really doesn't see this the way that we do, like, tell me where your pain comes from and help me understand what you see from your side of this story. And I think that ultimately that's the only way that we'll make our way out of this, is to rehumanize each other and ourselves in the process. So to your college kids and to mine, I have only love, only great love right now. And yes, be proud of your Jewishness, and always remember that to be a Jew also means to hold compassion and curiosity and empathy, like, with us all the time.
Carly.
Hi, I am so thrilled you're here. And I feel like if I was at UCLA instead of Cal State Fullerton at the very same time you walked into ICAR, I would have been there with you. But I saw it from the other side of the country in New York. And that time, I think it's really fascinating that that was the moment you stepped in, because I realized how much the world shifted, particularly like that year was the beginning of social media. I remember my friends at UCLA inviting me to this thing called Facebook because, our parents didn't have access to this thing. It was like only for university students. And so this thing that was a part of that era of you walking into the beginning of this community, I just feel like it's so prescient in this moment. And I think about where we stand now 20 years later. I mean, we're both still 21, but it's fine. But I guess I think about what's necessary to break through, because everything since probably May 2022, I think, has really made me feel like it's very difficult to verbalize what I feel, because I want to hold space for both peoples. I want to hold space and know that there are multiple truths. But I feel like when I walk into a space as a Jew amongst my friends, amongst people who I feel like I've advocated for time and time again, the marches that I've been to, the spaces that I've taken up on behalf of people that I love and know need advocating for, and then to walk into that space after October 7th and feel like I'm going left and they're coming right and nobody's looking me in the eye, I don't know how to have the conversations anymore, because I feel like the ability for them to see me as human has now been hijacked from folks who used to stand side by side with me. And I absolutely want to approach everything with empathy, and I feel like that's why I love Rabbi Adam so much, why I love your work so much, standing in these communities where I know that things begin with empathy. I can only have so much empathy without feeling like I have to make myself smaller. I have to make my Judaism smaller. And I don't know how to navigate that with people who know me.
What's your name?
Carly.
Carly, thank you so much for that. I'm sure that your words resonate with many people who are in this space. And this is one of the things about, going on a book tour during this time. Like, I'm feeling this pain in so many of our Jewish spaces. And I mean, the one thing I will say to you is, do not make yourself smaller. Do not make your Judaism smaller. Our Judaism is our guiding force. This is the lens through which we see the world. We did not engage in the battle for a just and loving society because that would guarantee that people would then be nice to us when the time came. We did that because that is the core promise that we made to God after we were brought out of enslavement in Egypt. And so, I mean, this is so core to who we are for the last several thousand years of our existence. And that is who you are and who you are and who I am and who Kvod is. Like, this is who we are in the world. And it's a real pain. It's painful when people don't see us when we are hurting. And so I don't think the answer is for us to diminish ourselves or diminish the pain that we're experiencing. Some of these relationships might be irreparable, But I believe that many of them, we can find our way back to each other, and it's just going to take some time. I did give a sermon that you referenced earlier. I gave a sermon recently about though I've been thinking so much about Jewish mourning rituals through this book, through talking about the book. And one of the things that I realized as I've been speaking about it so much is that when we are in Shiva, we are in our deepest period of grief, and we are not in a bridge building phase of life. The only people who come to the Shiva home are people who love you and will hold your broken heart with care. And you can't stay in Shiva forever. And there has to be a moment where you get up and you walk around the block and you see that the rest of the world is also living and breathing and in pain and in anguish and in love and holding all of the complexities of life. And you can start building bridges. And not everybody in the Jewish community is in the same place. Some of us are still deep in our Shiva. And some of us have taken the walk around the block and are saying, okay, I need to fix some of these things. And I need to actually quietly go to some of my friends who ghosted me and say, I needed you, and where have you been? And those are really painful, hard conversations that we cannot do when we're in the depths of it. And so I do believe that some of that work can be done in the days ahead. I pray that it can be done. I will continue to work for and fight for a just and loving society. Even if those partners don't come back, I will build new partnerships. Do you know what I'm saying? There are lots of good people out there, more good people than bad, and those are the people who will be my partners in fighting for climate justice and fighting for the rights of immigrants and other things that we care so deeply about. But I want to just say one last thing, and maybe this is a good way for us to close, that one of the pain points of turning to the left, as many of us have in these last 4.5 months, is realizing that we're not being held, as you're describing, by those coming from the right. And at the end of chapter 1 of my book, I share this story that I talked to you about Ruby and Hart as we began our conversation. So 6 months after Ruby and Hart died, we had another tragedy in our community. It was just a terrible freak accident where this beautiful 20-year-old kid in our community who I loved so much died in a freak ski accident. And I was in Tel Aviv at my niece's bat mitzvah, and I got the call, and it was horrible, and I spoke with the parents. And then immediately I had to call Gail and Colin, to the parents of Ruby and Hart, to tell them, because I just couldn't imagine them finding out from a community email. And so I called them up, and they were silent for a moment. And then the first thing they said to me was, tell the parents of this boy that when they're ready, they should call us, because maybe we can help. And the reason I mention this now is because they were in no way coming from the right. They were turning to the left, and maybe will for the rest of their lives to some extent. But they were already able to cast their gaze to others who were turning to the left and walk alongside them and take their hand. And that is something we can do for each other in this time. So while we're all torn up and wondering, like, this friend and this friend and this friend and this movement and this, I'm so hurt, like, go off Instagram, go off social media, it's terrible. It'll only break your heart. But even as we're feeling heartbroken by who's not there, and even worse, who's actively celebrating atrocities committed against us, turn to see who else is coming from the left, because we can and we have been holding each other. And I imagine that if we all talked about this afterwards, you would agree that the Jewish community has been an incredible source of strength during the last several months. And it means something even more than it meant before, because we do see each other coming from the left, and we can hold each other, and we can weep together, and we can take comfort in finding our way to one another. And we must continue to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. Charlie was my bar mitzvah student in the year, the young man who died in the ski accident, in the year that I worked for you. And I worked with him on his Devar Torah for his bar mitzvah as a sensitive and brilliant kid. And I was in Rome. I had been officiating a wedding, and I saw the email, and I moved my ticket up to come home to be in time for the funeral. And I walked into the airport in Rome. Do you know this? And I looked in front of me, and who was standing in line checking in front of me were Gail and Colin, who had been in Rome as well. And we flew on the plane back home to Charlie's funeral. I don't exactly know what my theology does with that, except that there's something there. You tell these unbelievable, profound stories of moments when hearts open up and when in the very, very darkest of times we offer each other grace and light. And the community that you have built is a place that is rooted in those values and doesn't just hold them to itself, but projects it out into the world, gives us all a beacon to try to live up to, and a model of what's possible in spiritual community. And so I want to just ask if you would, by way of close, if you would offer us as a community a blessing. What do you bless us with?
Thank you. Thank you for asking that. Well, I'm going to ask, let's do two things. First, I really bless you that whether you feel like you're walking to the right or you feel that you are in a moment of your life where you're walking to the left, that you know that you are not alone, and that you are not powerless, that making the choice to show up when your heart is broken is choosing community, and it's choosing to let yourself be loved when it's really hard to access love. And choosing to see someone who's showing up when their heart is broken is choosing love as well. And that's the only way. I believe that these are kind of micro changes that we can all make in the way that we live that ultimately can actually transform our communities and transform our society. So I bless you that you continue to find your way toward one another in love and with love. And I want to ask you if you can do an act of kindness for me, which, as Rabbi Adam mentioned before, I would really love if we could say Mourner's Kaddish. And I don't know what your custom is here, but I'm going to say the reason that I call the book The Amen Effect is, as you'll see in chapter 1, I realized that the power of Mourner's Kaddish is not the theology, it's not the language, it's not the poetry, it's not even necessarily the history of this prayer. It's literally the fact of someone with a broken heart standing up in a room full of people and just saying, I'm not okay today, and the community saying, Amen. And then the person going on saying, like, I feel so guilty, I haven't even been able to grieve because I went straight from Shiva to Rosh Hashanah to Simchat Torah to the book tour. I'm like really worried that I've lost my chance. And the community saying, Amen, I see you. I can't make it better for you. I can't fix it for you. I can't pull you out, but I can see you and I'm not running away. So I would love if you could say amen for me. And I also know that I'm not the only mourner in this room. And so I want to ask if you are grieving the death of a loved one, or if you're observing a yard site, if you'll either rise or raise your hand. Are you in Shiva now? So I'm just gonna ask if we can take a look around this room and see the people who are standing now. And if you're not mourning, to stay seated for the prayer, because I want for us to get eyes on the folks who are in mourning right now. And our work, I should have started by saying it's really so powerful and meaningful to be in this place where we share great love for Michael, for your father, and for your husband, and is your mom? And so I know he has a seat here, and he will always be held with love in this place. And we share this loss and this great love as well. I am going to ask you to just lay eyes on each other for a moment and let us make this promise to one another that nobody's going to walk out, who's standing right now, nobody will walk out of this room today without having at least one person come over to them and say, Malach, tell me, how's your heart? Who are you holding with love right now? And then offering a blessing, just simple words of care and presence and love. And that's something that we can really do for each other. And I also, you mentioned my father's name is Rick Brous, Shalom ben Chanavileb, and I would love if we could also ask each other our loved ones' names, because as we lift up their names again and again and again, it helps us know that we're not holding them and their memory alone, but we're sharing them with the community and with the world. So there are Sidurim around the room. If you want to open to page 58 to join me, I'll lead, and you can... for those who are not standing, I just want to invite you, as you say the words amen, we have this habit of, making things kind of perfunctory because we do it again and again and again as Jews, but to just bring your heart into your amen, because it's an incredible gift that you're giving to each of us who are grieving today. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbi, bi'alma divra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'vizman kariv imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbi mevorach le'olam omei omaya, yiparach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitala v'yitalal shmei dekudsha brechu, le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tush b'chata v'nechemata, da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama Rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Osei shalom b'mromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. And since we have somebody in this room who's literally in the midst of Shiva now, and wearing the kriya, I'll just close by saying that the image that's on the front of the book is a garment that's been torn apart and is in the midst of being sewn back together. And the idea from our tradition is that we tear a piece of cloth when we suffer the death of a loved one, and we wear that around during the whole first week, the most intense period of our pain. But the rabbis were practical people, and they understood that you might not have that many garments. It used to be that people would, and not just used to, some people's practice today is to tear an actual shirt or suit jacket. And so they said you could actually sew it back together again, but only with rough stitches, maybe a different color, so that anyone who gets kind of close to you will say that's a person who's been torn apart. And then after 30 days, you can tear it with fine stitches. You can stitch it up with fine stitches, so only someone who really gets close to you, you know what I'm saying, like really knows you, says, oh, that's a person who's really been torn up. For a parent, you never stitch it back up all the way. And so we've been on this journey in parallel over these last several months. So the reason I chose this image for the cover is because it sometimes feels like we're all torn apart. We feel it individually, we feel it communally, we feel it in the larger social context, and we are torn apart, but we can be stitched back together. And when we are, it's not going to be the same that it was before. Just thinking about this last question about post-October 7th reality, it's never going to be the same as it was before. And yet we that will be in some ways a little bit maybe stronger because we've been through the journey, like scar tissue. After you've been opened up, the scar tissue is a little tougher than the rest of your skin. And so I just bless all of us that we remember that healing is possible. We can mend our broken hearts and our world, and we can do that work together. So thank you so much, and thank you to my beautiful friends. I'm so
Rabbi
grateful.
Sharon Brous. Unbelievable. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rabbi Brous. An extraordinary teacher. Thank you for coming and bringing your Torah. I want to thank Temple Beth El, Shir Hamalot, and CSP for helping to support this event. I want to thank the Jewish Community Foundation of Orange County for helping to make this possible. We are going to be moving a book signing table right here onto the bima, so invite people to queue up down the center aisle. There are also desserts over in the social hall. Invite you to stay, schmooze and kibitz. Thank you all again for being here, and thank you, Rabbi Brous, for sharing of your heart.